What got me interested in the theme of this show, which is Silt, Soot, and Smut, was doing a residency in New Orleans at the Joan Mitchell Center. I was really struck by, some 5 years after Katrina, how little had changed, and how there were so many promises by the city, by the nation, by the state that everything was going to be repaired. And when I would go from where I was staying to my studio, I would pass dozens of homes that were still vacated with X's on the doors. I had found a group of these old, beautiful sugar sacks that had stains, and some of them had been made into quilts, and we took the quilts apart. They were worn so thin, some of them, that you could actually see through them, and they had this feel that they had actually been lived on. And the other components I started using were these old mattress tickings and old pieces of linen and canvas that had been made into other things. And I started sewing them together to kind of create a canvas. I think part of the inspiration for those canvases were the quilts of G's Bend, where there were these beautiful abstractions used with found materials. I began to do these drawings on them first with gesso and some different chalks and charcoals, and then eventually worked into doing paintings that were utilizing acrylics and oils and things like that. So I was also doing some drawings on the drawers out of old steamer trunks. I'd take parts out, and they had these beautiful drawers, so they kind of made these really beautiful sort of 3-inch thick canvases. And they had, some of them had old linen on them already, but some of them I also added some of the sugar sacks to them and have a little bit more texture. And once I had all of these pieces quilted together, I wanted half of them to look like they were underwater. And so I used a traditional dyeing process, which is actually utilized all over the world, but I used indigo. And so this indigo has this really beautiful, deep blue color. I used these thicker pieces and thicker canvases for those that could have the indigo dyed over that, and then the painted colors were on top of that. Wash basins, buckets, jars, jugs, glass, silt, soot, tar, smut. So I became really interested in the history of flooding and its effect on African Americans in the United States, and that pointed to the flood in 1927, which was the Mississippi and all of its tributaries had basically gone over its borders and flooded state after state all the way down to the Delta. The African American sharecroppers were conscripted to build the levees, basically served as slaves, and were unable to evacuate their own families. And then once the floods had actually hit and the levees had broken, they were isolated on the levees and kept there intentionally so that they wouldn't flee. Basically, they were concentration camps. They had to wear physical tags, and without those tags, they wouldn't have permission to go into town or to leave the levee whatsoever. So it just really struck me how little had changed from the 1927 flood to the Katrina flood, and how racist policies in terms of African American or people of color and the poor were always put in harm's way. They are always in the bottomlands that are prone to flooding, and they, of course, don't have the funds, and they're never helped to evacuate, or in some places hindered. People in Katrina on the bridges really harkened back to these images of African Americans that were placed on the levees and forced to stay on the levees until the waters receded. What a lot of people don't realize is how the 1927 flood impacted United States history, and specifically the impact it had on music and jazz. Jazz was happening in New Orleans, and the blues was happening in the Delta, but with the flood, that all went north, and that became part of the Chicago blues movement and the Great Northern Migration. And so many of these songs, I think Bessie Smith, is probably the most noted one, with Muddy Waters, line-to-line accounts of the floods and their suffering that they had to endure during that time. When I did these paintings, I gave them each this title of a dance, and some of them were real, like the Black Bottom Stomp. Some of them are invented, like the Quagmire Quiver or the Slew Foot Slide, but they were all sort of related to songs and dance of the time. And it was really curious because people from the North were taking these songs and added on racist lyrics. The darkies are slipping and a sliding in the mud, which was obviously a direct reference to the 1927 in a very sort of really cruel and derogatory approach. And so I really started looking at these paintings and thinking about how it's ambiguous whether they're in some sort of agony or they're in some sort of ecstasy, and that they're either dancing or they're running. And I kind of want to keep this sort of in-between play. And the work then started to evolve to really talk about the river and African Americans' relationships in and of itself. And I became interested in including Mami Wata, who is a deity from the African diaspora, who's the goddess of the rivers. It really talks about that energy and that sort of give and take and play between African Americans living in the floodplain and the relationship to the Mississippi River. When it thunders and lightens and the winds begin to blow, when it thunders and lightens and the wind begins to blow, there's thousands of people ain't got no place to go.